Nice timing. Alright, I'm going to get right to it. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one person, for one people, to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume the powers of the earth to separate an equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been a patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assessment should be attained, and, when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly and continually for the opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the right of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining, in the meantime, exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of new officers to harass the people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies and ships of war without the consent of our legislatures. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to jurisdiction foreign to our constitutions and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English law in neighboring provinces, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example of fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our peoples. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun, with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their own country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, and to fall themselves by their hand. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless uh, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions of existence. He has incited treasonable insurrection of our fellow citizens with the allurements of forfeiture and confiscations of our property. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur a miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, this opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of a Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain his executable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to raise arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people, with the crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injuries. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts of the legislature to extend a jurisdiction over us, these our states, and we have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf on the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our eternal separation, and hold them as we would the rest of mankind, enemies in war, and peace friends. The two final We, therefore, representatives of the States of America and General Congress assembled, do in the name of the authority of the good people of these states reject and renounce all allegiance and subjection to the King of Great Britain and all others who may hereafter claim, through or under them. We utterly dissolve all political connection which may heretofore have subsisted between us and the people of Parliament of Great Britain, and finally we do assert and declare these colonies to be free and independent states, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states might do, And for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. So, something I learned earlier today, while I was, I don't even remember, I was listening to the radio or something, and somebody brought this up. I'm I can't remember who at the time. It was just this kind of eclipsed everything I was thinking. I didn't know about this. I didn't know about this draft of the Declaration of Independence. Now, what I read to you was mostly that draft. I left out most of the changes, um, and pretty much read the original draft with a few minor exceptions. Um, but this part here, highlighted, really stuck with me because this is the part that was edited out. And it really kind of, it just kind of blew my mind that I didn't know about this. I'm a little bit of a history buff, not an expert or anything, but I feel like this is something I would have wanted to know. And this is a very powerful, not just a refutation, just a condemnation of slavery specifically, um, and in very thorough detail on very personal and very moral grounds. And this was part of the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. And that was shocking enough. Shocking that it was taken out. And I don't. I want you to like stop and guess, because the reason it was taken out is because there were states that opposed it. But I want you to take a guess at how many states oppose this. Sorry, how many colonies? How many of the 13 original colonies? Just gonna give it a second, let you kind of make a guess. Two. 2 out of 13. The implications of of this right here are massive, and it was cut out because 2 states wouldn't give their consent to this. Now, granted, at the time, those 2 states were South Carolina and Georgia, as anyone might guess. But granted, at the time, that they were desperate to have the support of those states. If they declared independence and a civil war came and Georgia and South Carolina fought along the side of the British, you know, the other colonies feared that loss would be inevitable. Um, and so I, I don't want to say needed, they felt they needed unanimous consent uh, of all of the colonies in order to do this. And just 2 people got this massive deal taken out of the Declaration of Independence that would have changed so much of the conversation so fast about society and what America is and what it means. And the thing is I don't think it changes what America is or what it means, because I think this is still inherent in the idea of the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, but it's not stated directly there. And it wasn't stated directly there because politics. Um, which is a damn shame. You know, even even brave men sometimes they can just kind of lose their nerve and not want to stand up to their neighbors. Thomas Jefferson wasn't exactly a coward, and the other states that might have been willing to ratify this, it's like these are people that risked everything, and they weren't people with nothing that risked everything. These were moneyed men, wealthy men and women, and they were property owners and people that had opportunity to have high standing in British society. And they threw that away, and they risked never having anything to replace it very severely. It's like we talk today as if the revolution was a sure victory. But back then it wasn't. It was touch and go for most of the war, with the British being very heavily in favor, the favored to win. So these men risked a lot, almost lost everything. They weren't cowards when facing their enemies, but when facing their friends, they just got a little weak-kneed. And it's like they're probably right. South Carolina and Georgia probably wouldn't have signed that, at least not that day. But I'm not convinced the war would have gone much different without them. I'm not a historian, and I have my reasons for suspecting that don't have to do necessarily with history. But this hits me hard. And all I can think when I see this is this should have been a part of our history. And even though the idea remains, the wording of the idea that was left to us left this up to open debate. Whereas this document right here, in these words, left it in no uncertain terms. And I don't think it's debatable, because I know what a man is. But people who don't want to believe something can do all kinds of horrible things to shut their eyes to what's in front of their face. And anyway, I'm going to read this one more time just for good measure and emphasis before I sign out. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of a Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, by murdering the people on whom he has obstrued them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. I'm going to comment on a few things, then I'll probably read it one more time. I've read it several times today and I just can't stop. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain. You'll notice here that infidel and Christian are capitalized. This isn't a criticism of Christianity. This is a criticism of a king that claims to be Christian, but, in their words, is in fact behaving as an infidel. I mean, the list up to this point was bad enough. Using mock trials to send people to jail for crimes they didn't commit, for just letting your soldiers run rampant pillage and murder, and then having mock trials that don't actually hold them accountable and always declare them innocent. You know, like, there's some seriously bad stuff in here. But this was the one where he uses this harsh language and calls the king unchristian. This is the most severe, the harshest, most intense language in the Declaration of Independence, which is a document full of intense, harsh, and severe language. At least for the time. It's not enough F words for modern people to think it's intense, but at the time this was very, very intense. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. Several colonies, several states were trying to limit or prohibit outright the buying and selling of slaves and slave labor, and the king wouldn't let them. And then he tried to incite riots in the slaves, telling them to fight for freedom against their masters here, when he intentionally created a system where they couldn't be free, they had nowhere to go, had no education and no way to get it, could have no standing in society, and he would not allow the local powers to change any of that. So if they had succeeded and won their freedom, which probably wasn't the intent, what were they going to do? Where were they going to go? Like, founding fathers weren't perfect. But to say that Slavery was the point and the purpose and the pure raw motivation of all the founding fathers, or even most of them, is bullshit. These aren't the words of somebody who thinks that slavery is the way they're going to build a nation. These are the words of a man who hates it from the core of his being. And had to give up the destruction of that institution in order to form another. It's easy to moralize now and say, well, he should have done both and just lost the war. I mean, it's easy to say. How many moral, just horrors do you tolerate in this country now? It's easy to judge people who've been dead 200 years. But, can't fight every battle at once. So, I'm going to read it one last time. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain his exercible commerce. He has prostituted his negative. That means he sold his no for money, when he could have said yes. People paid him to say no, and he took the money. He prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. I'm going to have to look up execrable. You can do that. That's your homework too. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people, with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. I got no more to say. Rulo out.